When John Lee and I decided to get together to write this 8,000 word article for security challenges, we thought we'd do what, in my experience, academics too rarely do, and that is, John, we would join together the disciplines of economics and strategic studies into a one discipline approach. When I asked John to join me in this, and I don't often do joint authored articles, it's generally a difficult process, but with John's case it was seamless and painless as far as I'm concerned. We talked about Paul Kennedy's seminal book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and Kennedy's clear conclusion that there is a very strong connection in the long run between an individual great power's economic rise and fall and its growth and decline as an important military power. But where we paused was that applying this important judgment to Australia's foreign and defence policies regarding the rise of China has led to strongly opposing views. There are those, as you know, including in this university, including some of our colleagues, who consider that the inevitable rise of China must result in that country becoming the naturally dominant power to which the United States must concede strategic space and acknowledge China's so-called legitimate strategic interests. There are others, including us too, as authors, who believe that China's endless and rapid rise economically is far from inevitable and perhaps even unlikely, and that its military power will continue to lag seriously behind that of America. The argument that China will emerge as Asia's preeminent power is based on assumptions that its economic and military capacities are expanding and improving at such a rate that regional dominance is all but assured. Yet the sustainability of China's rapid economic rise and capacity to embark on the path towards becoming an advanced and resilient political economy, in addition to its ability to become a genuine military superpower wielding proportionate regional influence, is widely assumed, but in our experience, rarely analysed in any depth, at least in Australian literature. In examining the factors that go towards the development of Chinese national power and its ability to use it to achieve national objectives, predictions about a Chinese superpower with the ability to dominate Asia would be premature, if not improbable, in our view. John, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. As Andrew mentioned, I've come on as an adjunct at the centre, so it's my privilege to give what I hope will be one of several lectures over time. Thank you all as well for taking the time to be here. I'll speak for about 20 minutes and then I'll hand over to Paul to speak about some of the military and strategic aspects of this issue. Now, we obviously don't know the future, and because we can't accurately forecast the future, we tend to rely on extrapolations of trends or trend lines, especially when it comes to predictions about material power, that is economic power and military power in the main. Now, extrapolations of trend lines are not completely useless. They can be useful, but they're essentially a window into the past. They do not tell you what will be. They tell you what has been. Trend lines also do not tell you much about causation. In fact, they don't even really talk about causation. They don't talk about or imply, you cannot infer from them why something occurred and whether something is likely to continue into the future, or why something may change or why it may not. Now, like all of you, I don't have a crystal ball in my lounge room. So the approach I'm taking, and I think the approach we took in this article, was to basically analyse China in unexceptional terms, and that is, you analyse China in the way that you analyse the material power and prospects of any other country. We don't have any belief in things like cultural determinism. We don't think anything is inevitable about a certain country or a certain culture or a certain political system. We merely look at China in the same way we look at any other country. Now, the title of our article why China will not become the dominant power in Asia. That's the title of that article. Paul, when I hand over, will talk about the military and strategic challenges and limitations faced by the Chinese. I will begin with the economic basis for why we think that this is the case. So let me begin with the widely accepted, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly accepted, but the widely accepted proposition that when it comes to economic power and the acquisition of national capability at least, time is on China's side. That all China really has to do is wait a couple of decades, as long as it doesn't do anything stupid, and the 1.37 billion people in their eyes will effectively determine the course of regional history. Now, in some respects, the trend lines say that this is so, but I will rely on economic reasoning to say why I don't think this is so. And while I'm not predicting economic disaster for China like some others might, the assumption that China will acquire the economic base to dominate Asia, short of American withdrawal, which I don't think is likely or conceivable, is pretty unconvincing in my view. So let me begin with the basics. As any economist will tell you, there's basically three ways you can grow your economy. You can add more labour inputs, you can add more capital inputs, or you can use one or both of these inputs more efficiently, what economists refer to as total factor productivity. Now, can China add more labour inputs significantly drive rapid growth or even moderate growth in the medium term? Well, I think the simple answer is no, and I say that because of its ageing demographics, which for a number of reasons will be pretty much impossible for China to alter. Now, there is one thing we know for certain, and that is that China will be the first major country in history to grow old before it grows rich, or before it grows even moderately rich. Now, in the 1980s, during its first decade of reform, the proportion of the working age population, that is 15 to 64 years, was almost 75%. It will decline to 65% in 2020 and 60% in 2035. Now, this may not sound significant or meaningful to you, so let me put this another way. When China began its reforms in 1979, there was 7 working people to every 1 retiree. Today, the ratio is about 5.5 to 1. By 2035, there will be 2 working people for every retiree. In fact, 2015, this year, is a significant year because this year is the first year that more people are leaving the workforce in China than entering the workforce since the reform period began. Now, before I say what I'm about to say, I have to apologise to Paul, who is an exception to the rule I'm about to articulate, but the most productive years of a worker is from their 20s to their late 50s. That is in developing countries. In advanced countries, the older people tend to have it. Now, the problem for China is that by 2035, there will be 1.5 older workers, that is workers from 50 to 65 years, to every worker under the age of 55 years. So by 2030, China will have the same demographics roughly as a country like Norway or Amsterdam. Incidentally, if you want a comparison, America is the only great power which has favourable demographics up to 2050. India, if you want to include India as a potential great power. Now, bear in mind as well that only 1/3 of all urban residents, which is about half the population, urban residents are half the population, and less than 5% of rural residents have some form of pension fund, central, provincial or local pension fund. And even then, the state's largely unfunded liability is expected to be around 40% of GDP by 2035. And this assumes quite generously that China will continue to grow at 6% up to 2035, which I think is unlikely. Now, this will obviously increasingly compete with other budget items such as national security and military spending. Now, even for those with a pension fund, at least half their living expenses will still be picked up by their family. So whereas up to a quarter of the growth from 1980 to 2005 can be attributed in some way to the so-called demographic dividend, that is a massive increase in productivity of young workers coming into the cities with very little family responsibilities. There will be no such prospect of a demographic dividend for China from now on. Now, let's talk about adding capital inputs. And this is the real problem for China's future economic resilience. Now, speaking in very generalised terms, growth in the first decade of reform, 1979 to 1989, was driven by genuine entrepreneurialism and dynamism. Land reforms allowed not landowners, but the land occupiers to use the land in any way they wanted. They were allowed to sell surplus produce at market prices, and this gave birth to a wave of spontaneous and unplanned entrepreneurialism and bottom-up economic activity, and eventually the rise of smaller-scale industries, which was a real driver of early industrialisation in China. Now, by the mid-1990s, this model was running out of steam, and what was emerging was China as a major export manufacturing country, not just in Asia, but in the world. So it was from the mid-1990s onwards that made in Korea or made in Japan or made in America or made in Malaysia was replaced by made in China. So prior to the global financial crisis, or just a couple of years before that, the major driver of Chinese growth was net exports. Now, there was nothing remarkable about this. This was really just the model that Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, amongst others, pursued, but China took it to a much larger scale because of the surplus pool of labour that they had. Now, export-dependent models obviously need growing end consumer markets, and this became a problem for China when the global financial crisis hit the advanced economies and consumption markets ground to a halt. So China had to find a different way of generating growth, and this is what they did. Now, if you take the period from 2004 to 2014, the Chinese economy expanded a pretty impressive 162%. About labour inputs, or additional labour inputs, contributed around 6% of that, but enormous 136% can be attributed to capital inputs, mainly in the form of fixed investment, which is basically building, constructing things. This means that only 20% of growth out of 162% over the last decade was due to using inputs more productively. Now, these are all economic numbers, okay? Why do they matter? Well, the enormous level of capital inputs needed to generate the growth that China has achieved in the last 10 years has meant that national corporate debt levels have risen from 147% of GDP from the end of 2008 to over 250% of GDP at the end of 2014. Now, to put these numbers in context, it increased by from $9 to $10 trillion US in 2008 to $20 to $25 trillion US in 2014. Now, this increase represents an amount larger than the entire size of the American commercial banking system. Now, it happened, this increase happened because in the government's determination, or some people would say in the government's desperation to achieve rapid growth, the Chinese government ordered state-owned banks to lend predominantly to state-owned enterprises, even when there was no commercial justification for doing so. So from 2008 to 2009, for example, bank loans almost doubled from $750 billion US to $1.4 trillion US. The outstanding bank loan books of China's banks expanded almost 60% in 2 years. So this clearly is not due to natural